All right. Awesome. All right, let's get Laura on here. Happy Monday, everyone. We're going to be talking about the postpartum pelvic floor. So after you have a baby, postpartum, and postpartum can mean like hours after birth, days, weeks. It can mean a lot longer than that, though. I definitely say that once you're postpartum, you're always postpartum in a sense. So, let's see if I can invite her on here. There we go. Okay. Hello.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going.
Happy Monday.
Definitely. It's definitely a Monday for sure. Move my camera back. I've got like a close up here. Okay. Okay. Awesome. All right. So today we're going to be talking about the postpartum pelvic floor. So what that looks like, short term, long term, what certain symptoms might be, how to cope with certain symptoms, and when to seek treatment, and then hopefully we'll address a little bit of what postpartum physical therapy or occupational therapy looks like for people who don't know, and then we'll answer any questions that come up.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. All right, awesome. Okay, so postpartum, for people who may not know, means post-birth. So after pregnancy and birth, this can be when a lot of pelvic floor issues first surface. Maybe not. Maybe they've been there before. Maybe this is not your first baby. But so we tend to see a lot of pelvic floor issues postpartum, just because of the impact of birth and the stress of birth and the event, and then following postnatally, the recovery of the pelvic floor. So do you want to talk a little bit about, we talked last week about pregnancy and the stress that your pelvic floor is under during pregnancy. Do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of like the occasion of vaginal birth and what that can do to pelvic floor?
Sure. So, when you think about, postpartum, it's an injury, essentially. You've been through a traumatic experience, and it's basically an injury that you're recovering from.
Right.
So whether it looks like a vaginal delivery or a C-section or whatever, your kind of journey was through delivery, it makes sense, like any other injury or surgery, to have rehab afterwards. So, Europe kind of gets it. They automatically give every postpartum woman a set number of physical therapy or occupational therapy pelvic floor visits. We're not quite there yet, but nope. People are starting to advocate for themselves. They're starting to seek this out, whether, if they didn't get an assessment to start kind of being the body awareness beforehand, certainly, postpartum is a great time just to be able to make sure that you are healing and doing the right things, because there's a lot that can be very counterintuitive. There's also a lot that can be, your body, especially like for really fit women, your body can feel ready to start doing certain activities before your pelvic floor may be ready. And Absolutely. It's hard because you may not have that feedback to kind of, slow yourself down or guide you. So just really having a great awareness, you don't know what you don't know. So, seeking out that initial assessment and just having that conversation. So you're starting to be aware of these things. And then to get a good, baseline of how to start moving, because, you hear that you deliver and then you have the 6-week checkup, and then that's like the magic time that you can
Right.
return to all activities, right?
Right.
So, but 6 weeks is a long time. What do you do in 6 weeks? You don't do nothing. You know, they say don't exercise, but that's not realistic because our life is exercise. We
Right.
have to care for ourselves. So we have to care for our baby. And for a lot of us, we have to care for an older child as well. So we're physically active, and
Right.
it only makes sense to be doing those activities mindfully and
Right.
incorporating your pelvic floor and your core and your breath and your posture as soon as possible.
Yeah.
So, you know, you don't have to wait until that 6 week mark to be seen and start to really, you know, get benefits of healing yourself in a good, safe, responsible way. So that's my biggest take is I was like, oh, well, my 6 week checkup is coming. And I'm like, well, what are you doing right now?
Right. And I mean, and
Um,
on the other side of that too, you know, a lot of women think that their 6 week checkup or their 8 week checkup, if they had a C-section, is like a green light to like go back to normal things, because that's really, in most part, typically what women are told. Like, okay, so you can resume normal exercise. And like some women are like, yes, and are like back in the class like that day. And then some, you know, will go out for a run that day. And then some will go, wait, what do you mean? Like, I don't even recognize this body. I don't even know where to start. And so, you know, there are definitely resources, thankfully, in the capital region, including you and I, you know, for people who are, you know, trying to navigate that return to exercise, to see what that looks like, you know, and kind of take it slowly and do it in a way that's going to be sustainable, and, you know, take it slow. So not necessarily like do nothing and then do all the things,
mm-hmm.
but don't do nothing and then keep doing nothing, and or don't go, you know, balls to the walls immediately as soon as you feel good after birth. Because I mean, I've had clients who've told me like a week after birth, they're like, I feel really good. I'm like, that's great. Keep feeling good.
Yeah.
Keep doing, you know. So yeah. So yeah,
Yeah.
definitely lots of pieces of that.
Yeah. And, you know, learning how to connect and to be able to engage the pelvic floor and the core to make sure that you're not adding that downward pressure that could, you know, you may not have prolapse immediate postpartum, but if you overdo it before your pelvic floor is ready, then you could be setting yourself up for
Yep.
prolapse symptoms. And certainly like any sort of, you know, red flags or signals that you're maybe overdoing it and need to pull back would be leakage. And there's some leakage that can happen immediately postpartum, but if it's still happening a week or two out, and it's significant, then that's a red flag that you might need to either learn how to move through your day differently, or pull back from some activities that you're doing.
Right.
That heaviness feeling in the pelvic area, heaviness, or it sometimes like people describe it as like it feels like there's a tampon in there, but there's not. So those are all kind of descriptive words that make me think that there might be a little bit of downward shifting. And just because there is some downward shifting of the pelvic organs right away doesn't mean that that's what is going to be, you know, for the long term, because, you know, you've had a lot of trauma to that area, the tissues are healing. And if you're breastfeeding, you're going to have those hormones that are still keeping things a little bit relaxed in there. So even, you know, your duration of your breastfeeding, you can still expect changes to occur when you wean off of breastfeeding.
Right. Absolutely.
And so,
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, I definitely want to talk about that for sure.
yeah. And so like the pelvic organs in here, so you have kind of your bladder and uterus. So they're in this bowl. And so if they're hanging lower, you're going to have a sensation. Here's the vaginal opening. You're going to have a sensation kind of in this space here if they're kind of pushing into the vaginal space. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't necessarily mean, we can get into this more with the prolapse, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your pelvic floor is weak. It just means that things have been shifted and disrupted, and that we just need to start to coordinate again and manage our pressures really safely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and then so if you were to speak to someone who was like immediately postpartum, so she was like a couple days after her birth, and you wanted her to, she wanted to start moving, she wanted to start being proactive about her pelvic floor and core connection, what would you start her with? My assumption is breathing.
Yeah. Well, you
How
could
would you,
pretty much say that for everything.
how would you describe that to her for like, what would she pay attention to with her breath mechanics?
Yep. So, first starting to go into that, good diaphragmatic inhale and start to feel the movement going out into the ribs, because you're going to be able to easily move through the abdomen because it's all kind of starting, it doesn't have its connection yet. So it would be easy to just kind of lose that movement forward when you inhale, and really trying to get them to focus on that rib motion. So we're drawing that diaphragm down that's been kind of stuck up here for a while. So really getting that diaphragm down, which will overflow into the pelvic floor and get some good lengthening. And then with the exhale, thinking about engaging, so closing and lifting those pelvic floor muscles with the exhale, and just sequencing that, and not aggressively, not doing aggressive Kegels. But just connecting. It's all about just reconnection and starting to get those systems working together again.
Yeah. I remember after my, my C-section, that was like really painful to do diaphragmatic breathing. I remember sitting probably a couple days, maybe a week after, I'd had my little boy, and I was like sitting on a chair, and I was like, oh, I'm going to try some diaphragmatic breathing while I'm sitting here. And I literally took a deep breath into my belly, and I was like, ow.
Yeah, because you're stretching those tissues that are healing.
Yeah. That incision.
Yeah. Yeah. So, taking it away from that space a little bit and letting them heal. And then, once they're healed and it's tolerable, then starting to look at some scar management, and massage. But, if you can still really be able to avoid that tenderness, and disrupting that area by refocusing into the back space and into the lateral rib space.
Right. So like kind of keeping the breath focus a little bit higher so that you weren't like kind of pushing down into where the incision is.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I was like, oh no, breathing hurts.
Now what?
I have nothing left. So then, we're talking like short-term postnatal, definitely focus on breathing. Are there any other movements that you suggest, like say like, 2-3 weeks down the line and they're like, okay, I'm ready to start moving. Are there certain things that you suggest? I know if I get an email about like, I'm losing my mind, please give me something to do, before I can come back to class. Cause we require clearance from their doctor or midwife to come into the studio just for like liability purposes.
Yeah.
But if someone emails and says, oh my gosh, what do I do? Give me something to do. What would you advise them to do?
Yeah. So, and just, I'm going to get to that. I just had a thought when you were saying that. Like sometimes they just need that social aspect, that mental health aspect of being back in the gym or being around their peers. So sometimes, being able to allow for that, but like make sure that they know that they need to like be kind of limited according to what the clearance level is.
Yeah, I mean, we have our early postpartum class is that, and that's what we do specifically with early postpartum classes. Like we accept, people who are ready to come back, and we mitigate all of the exercises, and they're specifically designed for the postpartum body. So we definitely allow for that. But letting someone back into a kettlebell class at 6 to 8 weeks postpartum, I'm like,
yeah, no. Yeah.
For you. It's a prerequisite for them to get back into the normal classes, the early postpartum class.
That's good.
But yeah, do you give them like certain movements that they would do at home?
Yeah, I would say like that first, like immediate postpartum, like 0 to 2 weeks, just the reconnecting with the breath and the pelvic floor and that inner core. And walking is great, building up their tolerance for walking. And then, breaking down the posture, the pelvic posture and the rib posture and the head posture, is very important to be able to, one, start to reestablish the connection with the core, but also to make sure that we don't start to have any strains or injuries elsewhere. So, looking at, okay, how do you roll over in bed? How do you go from lying down to sitting up? How do you go from sitting to standing? And making sure that all those mechanics are there. Because, I mean, essentially, you're doing a bridge in bed to move. You're doing a squat to stand up and sit down. You're
Right.
doing exercise movements. You're just not doing them repetitively. So, but you
Right.
still want to make sure that you're not holding your breath and bearing down when you go to stand up. Or when you're breastfeeding, that you're not sitting back in this kind of recline, semi-crunch, downward bearing position.
Right. Right.
Or to get out of it, you go into this kind of heavy crunch. So that's that kind of immediate postpartum. Because again, like we're not doing nothing. We're actively, changing the diaper, the changing table, or however you have it set up, if it's on the floor or on the bed,
Right.
breaking all those down. So then when you get into like the 2 to 4 weeks, I like to start to add, because again, I mean, our movement is exercise. So I don't think we need to completely limit ourselves to nothing.
Right.
But starting to open up that thoracic space. So this part, getting some nice trunk rotations. So whether it's like laying down, and the knees are both onto one side and you're opening up through here is really great. And that's going to help with the diaphragm. It's going to help with the ribs and that thoracic spine. Anything that can help, like some angel wings along the wall, that can really help for that upper back and that neck area.
Right.
And then starting to think about sometimes not quite a bridge yet. Though, I mean, we are pretty much doing bridges in bed. So I'm not against bridges as long as I've kind of seen them and assessed that they're doing them the right way. I'm not a fan of doing that roll up bridge unless the goal is for spinal mobility.
Yep. Exactly.
So if we're looking for stability, which at this point we're really trying to kind of get the pelvic posture kind of back into that, more optimal position.
Yep.
And starting to stabilize around it and bring the core into it. So, looking at some bridges, but maybe even just, if that's too much for now, just glute squeezes or even like presses against the wall,
Right.
can be nice. What else? So I like to start so not doing like full squats, but, practicing that hip hinge. So we're again, trying to start to get the posture lined up and start the movement coming from the hips as we bend forward. So like using the pole along the spine is a really good cue to align the head, the upper back, and the sacrum, and practice that hip hinge and maybe just a slight little squat. Because that will carry over when you're washing dishes or brushing your teeth, anything with like a slight forward bend. To be able to engage the core and not start bending at the upper back or at the lumbar spine.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, obviously, the days and weeks following birth, you're sitting down and you're standing up from the toilet and you're sitting down in a chair, right? So like, I think a lot of women, especially if they've had a traumatic birth or if they've had a C-section, they tend to do that like instinctual breath holding when they do those kind of things that cause stress to their abdomen and to their incision, or pelvic floor, whenever stress hits us, we automatically go, right? That's just like our body breathing, our body action. Yep. It's training yourself out of doing that and saying like, no, this is not, I need to like, okay, take a breath. And then as I do the hard thing, I'm going to exhale. So like try to exhale on exertion and try to like, almost like program yourself to do that. That's definitely, I think that's helpful because you're like, it hurts.
Yeah. Cause it's building it's building that reconnection. So adding the breath and the engagement and then adding a little bit of movement with it. And then that can just reinforce it. So then when you do something more strenuous, you have more of that automaticity. It like kind of kicks in on its own. So we're just kind of building those pathways again in the early stages.
Yeah.
And Julie Weeb has a great, she's a pelvic health physio or a physical therapist. And she talks about blow before you go. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people, they think that they're exhaling as they stand up or they do the activity, but they get into this
Right.
pattern. So they've held their breath during the initial hard part, and then they release it when they're halfway up. So starting the exhale and then continuing it through the activity.
Yep.
Is kind of like a pattern to get, you know, to
Right.
practice and to get used to and to the habit of.
So starting the exhale first, kind of starting that first little part of your exhale, and then continuing it through the movement to like really make sure that you're getting it.
Yeah. Yep.
So I get this question a lot, and I think it's a little bit of like it's like an overvisited question, but getting up out of bed. Okay. Like say like in the middle of the night, your baby starts to cry, you have to get up and go get them. A lot of women will instinctively sit straight up, especially if it's not painful. But I've heard in the past through many different PTs and pregnancy, postpartum specialists that you should roll and then get up. But then I've heard that because women are doing that for such a long time and get into the habit of doing that, their abdominal muscles will atrophy. So like the muscle basically will like not exist over time because it's not being used. What's your opinion? Is there like a timeline in when you can like sit straight up, or should you start to roll? And then how will you know that you're ready? So yeah.
So that's an interesting one. I have not heard that. I mean, the rolling, yes. You know, I teach that. I mean, I teach that not just for postpartum, but for someone who's got back pain or bulging herniated lumbar discs, or, you know, any sort of biomechanical dysfunction. So, you know, instead of like, if you go to sit straight up, you're doing a crunch, and most likely you're holding your breath, and you're, you know, straining yourself, and you're putting a lot of downward pressure on the pelvic floor. So if you roll to your side and then kick your legs off, the legs can be kind of like a little counterweight, and then you push up to your, on your side, you're using this to pull yourself up instead of this and pushing down.
Right.
So it's just really safe, and it makes it easier.
Yeah.
And I feel like we use our abs in so much of our life. I don't know if restricting that crunch when you sit up will atrophy our core muscles. I mean, certainly if you're really underactive and that's the only ab work that you get, but I mean, you know, lifting and reaching, we're using our core for all those activities. So.
Yeah, I went to a workshop with Anthony Lowe. I don't know. So yeah, I went
he's great.
Female athlete workshop, and he asked for volunteers, and so I went up because I knew I had an ab separation. And he was like, okay, I'm gonna we'll assess your diastasis. So I was like, okay, I was really excited, and this is after I had my third, which was a C-section, and he assessed me, and he was like, the issue is not that you're not strong. The issue is that you have not been using your rectus muscles like at all. Okay. So like I had been like training and had just been avoiding that like forward, any kind of flexion forward, up, any sit-ups, crunches. Cause I was kind of taught that they were like anathema. You shouldn't do them postnatally because they'd make my diastasis worse. And he was like, no, he was like, don't be ridiculous. You know, you need to be working in like hollow holds, and, you know, you can do sit-ups. It's okay. He's like, just, you know, start where you're at. And so I thought that was really interesting. And, you know, he was right in the sense that I wasn't accessing my deep core because I wasn't doing any kind of flexion at all. It was all just like, I mean, I did some planks, some straight arm push downs, but it was all like where my core was in neutral, not really bending forward at all. So I thought that was a really interesting take. He was like, you know, you're just not using those muscles. That's why they're not strong. He's like, it's not that you are making anything worse with your diastasis. So I thought that was really interesting. Even though I definitely had probably at rest like a 2.5, 3 finger separation by my standards. And when engaged, still have like a 1.5, 2 finger separation. So he did not see that as a problem. He was like, no, just do what you're doing. And I was like,
So crunches and sit-ups for a while in the pelvic health field were like, never ever do them.
Right. Yeah.
And a lot of activities were kind of like that in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
We've learned, I mean, because there's constant research coming out and development and, evidence-based research and information that is showing us, yeah, you can certainly do these things, but you need to make sure that you're ready for it. So
Right.
Anthony Lowe, he has a great way of explaining, you got to find your borders.
Yep.
Okay. You got to find where you can safely, without bearing down or having symptoms,
Right.
go to. And then once you start to break down, pull it back, work there, get good at that, and then progress forward. So, So in loading the tissue is how you get stronger. So just like full avoidance is not great, by any means. But, if you're having symptoms when you go to sit up, like that's a great technique to be able to use. But you'll probably find once you get stronger, you won't need to, and you'll just kind of automatically be getting up. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I had someone who was probably about 6 months postpartum, and she really didn't have any like measurable diastasis. And she said to me one day, just in the middle of class, she was like, because she got off a floor and she rolled to get up. And it was like this instinct. And I was like, why did you just roll? And she was like, oh, no, sit up. And I was like, no, you can sit up. I was like, you're like 9 months old. Like, you can sit up. You're fine. You don't have any kind of back pain. You don't have any kind of, like long-term diastasis issue. She wasn't bulging at her belly. It was like, I was like, no, you can sit up. She's like, oh, okay. And it was like, just because she got that validation, she was like, oh, okay, I can do that now.
Yeah. And it's, sometimes we have this fear and we get kind of stuck in a place.
Totally.
Until we can, be told or be kind of shown that it is safe and that we are capable of doing this. And,
yeah, really important to know that's like I think that's a big part of, postpartum when it comes to pelvic floor, when it comes to core recovery, when it comes to return to exercise. A lot of it is like fear-based, not in the sense of like, oh my gosh, I can't do anything necessarily, but also in the sense of, oh my gosh, is my body always going to be like this? Or, if I did, put in some effort, would I really see changes? Would I look different? Especially for first-time moms, they see their body and they're like, I don't know whose body this is. This doesn't feel like my body. It doesn't feel like it did before. Is it never going to feel like that again? And I think like, or like even having stress of, can I get back into a movement and exercise routine when my baby is like constantly needing me, when I'm like, on call 24/7, if you are number one to that baby, which, most moms are, that's like, it's a lot of pressure to think that like you have to be there all the time. And if your baby starts to cry, you're like, oh my gosh, what if the baby cries? I'm at the gym, I'm taking time for myself, or I'm in the basement working out. And you know what I mean? So it's like, it's hard. There's like a lot of mental aspects to like the postpartum exercise.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And just, having some emotional support to be able to feel okay doing those things. And then if the time isn't there, then building in your exercise routine into your daily life. Because I mean, let me tell you, when I'm doing the laundry, it's exercise. So you can like kind of practice the squats and like do the full form instead of just kind of going through the motions and just getting it done and having bad form. Right. Do the form and make it an exercise, and then you've built it into your day. Or like folding laundry. I mean, that's a really good workout. And like using like, don't make it so close. Like maybe at first you want to set everything up as easy as possible, but then maybe spread things out so you're kind of getting this forward movement as you're kind of reaching and placing and folding. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now, as far as like the C-section recovery, and then a lot of moms think like, okay, if I get a C-section, my pelvic floor is basically going to be intact postnatally. And, I think that that's a complicated assumption, because not only was your pelvic floor under stress during pregnancy, but you also have this incision that is very much connected to your core and your pelvic floor, tissue-wise, and fascia and all those things are attached. And so a lot of women are very surprised when they have kind of pelvic floor symptoms, like symptoms of dysfunction, leakage, prolapse, pain, anything like that. They're surprised, like, well, I had a C-section. Like, well, that doesn't always mean that, you're get off scot-free with your pelvic floor. So what do you tell women that have C-sections?
Just that absolutely that abdominal pelvic fascia connection is so deep. I mean, just as embryologically as we develop, we kind of transition down from that, abdominal space into the pelvic region. And there's so much connective tissue, and the pelvic floor is responding. If you think of the fascial connections, if you've got kind of a kink in the chain, it's going to affect above and below and around it. So that scar tissue or the trauma through that space is the pelvic floor is going to respond to it. It's either going to start working harder, or it's going to be restricted so it can't connect as well.
Right.
And again, the abdominal wall is that part of that core piece, and the pelvic floor is a piece of that system. And then just, any sort of like general healing and circulation and the nervous system.
Yeah, absolutely. And so do you, when do you recommend doing scar massage? And could you kind of talk a little bit about scar massage? Because I find that very few women are told that they should massage their C-section incisions. And a lot of women think, oh, well, I'm, this many years postpartum, I can't do anything about it now. When can they address it, especially when there's maybe some emotional trauma that it's tied to their C-section? Maybe they weren't expecting to have a C-section, they had a traumatic experience. How do they begin to address their scar?
Yeah. And I think, for each person, it can be very different, because like you said, there can be very different emotional connections to it. And just really being aware of that. And so the first step, so to get into the scar management, I would wait until it's healed and it's cleared by your doctor. Mm-hmm. But certainly, as it's in that healing phase, any sort of, like if this is the scar, any sort of like desensitization that you can start around it, above and below, off to the sides. Once it's healed, then even just starting with light touch, because a lot of times people, and I didn't have a C-section, but just even my pelvic floor and my vulva, I didn't really want to look at it. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to know. And that's very common. People are like, well, I'm just going to disconnect from it a little bit. So a lot of people haven't looked at it. A lot of people haven't touched it, or they're really nervous and anxious to touch it. So sometimes even starting over clothing, just doing light touch over clothing, whatever you can start to tolerate, and then building. And then, when you get into actual scar massage, there's different ways to massage above and below, and then directly to, and you're thinking anything with like fascia or scar tissue, you're thinking direction. So you want to kind of free up and mobilize, up and down, side to side, and then the different diagonals.
Yeah. And then for women who have, who are maybe a little bit further postnatal, so we're talking years postpartum after their C-section, and can they still address their incisions? Yeah.
I mean, if you didn't get to do it before, it's never too late. And you want to be able to free it up. If anything's stuck and restricted, it's going to affect other things and function. So right. I find even like people who have had laparoscopic surgery, so they have like a little tiny scar in their abdomen. Mm-hmm. Because you don't see a big scar, they don't really consider doing scar management. But when they go in laparoscopically, they end up kind of searching around a little bit more because they're not seeing. So right. there's scar tissue underneath the scar that is worth freeing up and mobilizing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on that same point, numbness is also a very big piece of, C-section scars. I've had a lot of people say like, oh, well, I can't feel this side of it, or, I have like basically nothing around it. I just, and I try to explain like, well, sometimes the nerve endings get severed. And so then, if you don't encourage blood flow to that area, then they're less likely to heal. So if we're talking like years postpartum, can they still regain feeling in that C-section scar?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and like you said, it's, you know, getting the circulation, the blood flow into that space and being able to, you know, allow for those nerve endings to heal by. Nerves have to kind of regenerate. They have to go all the way back to the source and then regenerate out. So it takes a while. So yeah, I mean, I think at any point that you can start to address it's going to be beneficial. It's not going to hurt one. And, you definitely start to see some good benefits from freeing up that tissue.
Speaking of hurt, we have a question here. Should it be
Mm-hmm.
expected to hurt with scar management?
So, I mean, scars can be painful for
Mm-hmm.
sure. So, you know, being able to work within your tolerance, you know, I don't think you need to be I mean, you're not going to do it if you're crying and it's really painful, then it's more you need to first desensitize.
Yep.
And work and, you know, build your tolerance up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with a couple of women that I've worked with, I've recommended that they have their like if they don't want to touch it, they're like, I don't even want to look at it. I don't want to touch it. I don't want to pretend. I want to pretend it's not there. And so
Yep.
you know, I've recommended having like their partner you know, have a look at it and start the scar massage for them. And that's been really helpful. And it's also been a source of like mutual understanding of like what, you know, the woman went through in birth, and, you know, this connection and like how deep this incision is and how important it is for her to be able to regain that connection and be able to be given the tools and support in order to make that full recovery. So that's worked a couple of times.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, that's definitely, I mean, that definitely helped quite a few people that I worked with. I think for me, I had my, the woman that I went to for pelvic floor PT at Albany Memorial, she did it for me first. I was like, I don't want to touch it. You do it. And she was like, okay. So
Yeah.
that was like helpful for me. I was like, okay, how much pressure is too much pressure? I like wanted to know all the answers, you know, for this, because it was my first C-section, first C-section. So I just didn't know, you know, how I would even begin to address it. So it was helpful to have that in-person guidance.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And like, even with like pelvic floor manual work, I've trained a lot of partners in that and had them come in and,
Oh, wow.
you know, cause it's like, what do I do? What
Yeah.
am I supposed to feel? And, you know, just to build that language and communication between the two can be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. We just got another question. The question is, how do you know when you're having trouble with scar endometriosis versus just scarring?
So, you would have to figure out if you have endometriosis, which is tricky because the only way to really know is to kind of have the surgery.
Right.
So, that's more like if you're really trying to tease that out, it's more of a conversation with your doctor to kind of figure that. But I mean, I don't think it's going to change anything that you'd be doing necessarily.
Right. Yeah. So like address the scar first and kind of do what you can do on your end. And then if you think that there's, you know, an unusual amount of discomfort and pain, you know, on a consistent basis, that's definitely a good sign to go talk to your OB. And yeah.
Absolutely.
Agree. Now, pelvic floor wise, you know, as far as like leakage, what would you consider to be normal versus something that absolutely needs to be addressed?
So, I mean, I think, you know, you have to give yourself a little bit of leeway within that first 1 to 2 weeks. And then if it's still persisting after that, I think then you want to start to consider maybe just how you're moving, you know, and the applied pressures downwards, maybe what you need to renegotiate, or maybe looking at having your pelvic floor muscles assessed. You're not necessarily going to get your pelvic floor muscles assessed at that 2-week mark, but that will, you know, that's going to be, you know, especially at your 6-week mark, that's what you're going to be going to see a therapist for, and they can give you that full internal assessment.
So what does that involve, the internal assessment post-NICU?
Yeah. So, I mean, so any like evaluation that I do, initial evaluation, does not necessarily have to have the internal assessment piece. There's a lot of different ways to be able to assess what the pelvic floor, what's going on in the pelvic floor. Because essentially what we want to figure out is it tight or is it weak? Or is it low tone or is it high tone? And so I can tell by my manual assessment. So I would So these front pelvic floor muscles, we can kind of assess if there's tightness, there's tenderness through like an external palpation and touch. And then internal would be kind of going through the different deeper pelvic floor muscles to see if they feel tight, if they have tender spots, to see, I check what their coordination is. So I would have you do a Kegel and do I feel that close and that lift and how strong is it? And then, can you let go of that? Is that smooth? And then can you do that inhale and lengthen of the pelvic floor? And can I feel that? And if not, then so I can feel exactly what's going on and give you the feedback and I'll give you different cues, but like, okay, so if I'm trying to get the pelvic floor muscles to lengthen and I tell you to imagine sitting on a nice warm beach. And as you inhale, you're going to inhale and melt down into the warm sand. And if I feel it tensing up, then we're gonna troubleshoot that, and we're gonna figure out how to get your body to connect and not tense up, and to be able to lengthen and open, or vice versa. If you're maybe getting some lift in your posterior pelvic floor muscles, but that there's like nothing happening in the front. There's not much squeeze happening around here.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll talk you through different cues, or maybe I'll have you change your pelvic tilt or your pelvic angle to be able to access those muscles a little bit better. So that's typically what the initial assessment looks like. So, but I can kind of talk through some of those things and have you use your internal assessment as well as kind of externally palpating, because these are your posterior pelvic floor muscles. So I can kind of feel like in the kind of like soft glute butt area, if I feel things lifting or if I feel things lengthening and bulging down when you're trying to. So that's kind of, what an assessment would look like if we did the internal piece. And then we would kind of also assess, surrounding all the other muscles and core and posture and breath.
So then along those lines, if you had a tear or if you were cut during birth,
Mm-hmm.
Do those scars heal in the same way as C-section scars? Do they need to be addressed manually in order for like optimal healing to take place?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not necessarily. It may just heal up nicely. But often, like if you have, like usually you'll see kind of like the scar here, or you feel a little bit more internal. And you can imagine if there's a kink, scars heal and it's thicker. So it's going to restrict the movement of all these muscles through here. So scar release, scar massage to that space as well. Same concept, same idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, we're even talking like if women have, first degree tear, like that minor tear, or if it's, more like, third, fourth degree tear, that they're more serious. Again, like there can be a lot of emotion surrounding, that kind of scarring or episiotomy, whatever happened can often like be very triggering. So, that can definitely, I would say, makes a lot of women hesitant to go see someone, for an internal assessment, because they're like, oh, I've had like enough. I just want to like leave it alone and pretend she's not there. But like she is.
Yeah. And I always, I explain very thoroughly, like that was a kind of a brief little explanation. So it may have pose more questions, but I'm going to sit down and I'm going to really thoroughly explain step by step what's going to happen, and that they're in control. We don't have to do anything that they don't feel comfortable with. If they have more questions, but I not only do I get their consent, I also like read them. I look at them and see if they're comfortable with this, because sometimes people are like, I'm just going to do it. Right. And you can tell that they're not ready, or they're just not at a comfortable place for that. So just really making sure that the person's okay with that and ready for it and not forcing themselves to just get through it.
Yeah.
I think is important. And then making sure that they know that sometimes you can have emotional responses, even if you're, maybe you're in your headspace, you're okay, nothing, you're just moving forward, but you could have a very emotional response from the tissue release. So I always prepare people for that, and that I give them, safe space. We can stop, we can process, you can process out loud, or we can just stop if it's too much, or have like a good, like safe go-to ahead of time. So like a color or a memory or a place that if there is, especially if there's, been like, I mean, birth is a trauma, but also if someone's had actual trauma, making sure, like a sexual trauma, making sure that they have like a predetermined like safety net to be able to go to. So
yeah, absolutely. I think there's there's so much more to like, occupational therapy, physical therapy than really people understand. It's not necessarily just a skill set as in like, you know what you're doing when you're doing the therapy. It's like so much more than that. And that really, at the end of the day, like that really matters so much. I mean, I've seen like 3 pelvic floor PTs, all very different personas. And I know what worked for me in the situation that I, was in, and how vulnerable I felt.
yeah.
So, but yeah, it's a really big part of it. And it's important for women to understand that, like, you want to help them, not just physically, but like, emotionally, you're there to support them. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, the psychosocial component of the biomechanical approach. So like we've got physical, symptoms, we've got, muscles and bones and joints, but I mean, it's all driven by the brain and emotions. We have a limbic system, we have autonomic nervous system. We've got all these factors coming into play. And you really have to, you can't just like zero in on one area. That holistic mind body perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we have a question. Is it painful to have trigger points treated internally like externally?
So actually there's a whole controversy if there are actually trigger points in the pelvic floor. So I would say, so yeah, I mean, if you've got tension or you've got tightness and it's tender internally in the pelvic floor muscles, it can be painful. And sometimes you may find some therapists that will kind of treat the trigger point like a trigger point, like in your shoulder, and it's press and hold and it hurts and you hold it until it kind of lets go and releases. So I think it depends on kind of what's going on and what therapist you have. I tend to take more of a gentle approach. And Ramona Horton is a mentor of mine, and she put it really well that our physical, like the manual techniques that we're using to be able to release tension is not necessarily stretching the tissue and holding it. That's actually creating the changes, because if we did, we'd have to stretch it so much that we'd probably interrupt some other structure, and we'd have to hold it for hours. but it's more of a conversation with the brain is how she puts it, and that just kind of like stuck with me, that we are, we're renegotiating, we're moving the tissues and the muscles, and we're allowing the brain to feel safe. We're allowing the brain to be able to stop sending that protective response, because that's why, it's there. It's trying to protect and preserve ourselves. So getting it to feel comfortable enough to be able to release that. And if you go too deep and it's painful, you're going to tense up around it. That's my philosophy. So I like to, like, even when I'm working with someone, I'll say, okay, is this tender? Okay, what number is it? And I know the number thing is frustrating, but give me a number. We're going to find a baseline. If it's like a 3 or a 4, okay, it's tolerable for them. Okay, let me know if it gets to a 5 or 6. I don't want to go above that. Okay, so little discomfort. We're treating that area. I don't want to go into a lot of discomfort because then we're probably going to start to undo what we're trying to achieve.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's an explanation. I think that's how I approach exercise too, and movement. Don't move into pain, because if you move into pain, you're not going to be creating change in your body. So yeah, it's definitely, there has to be a give and take with the nervous system, and what makes sense for your body, where your body feels safe, and then where you can push it a little bit further to feel like, okay, I'm capable of this, and this is an okay space for me, and so therefore we're okay here, and then we're going to push a little bit further next time until we get what is desired, the desired outcome, for sure.
Yeah. And feeling good after exercise, right? Like, people should feel good. They shouldn't be like achy and like exhausted and
this all the time. And this is for pregnancy and postpartum, and for really anyone who like does anything else with their life besides exercise, that you have to be able to function and like live your life, because that's the point of exercise, and that's the point of therapy. You want to live your life with I guess like a level that you want to live it to. You want to enjoy your life. You want to enjoy what you're doing. And if you can't walk down the stairs, that's okay sometimes to like be sore. And it's okay. That's okay. But to feel ridiculously sore after every workout is like, that to me is like a red flag. I'm like, well, what's wrong? What's happening here? Something is misfiring, that like, it's not beneficial at that point. You're just breaking things down, and you're not building them up, and you're not allowing their recovery time. So, but there's definitely a lot to that. And then one last thing I was just thinking, and I think this is probably like on a lot of women's minds, and I think we'll talk about this in a future week, but when we're talking about like postpartum and the pelvic floor, and then returning to sex, can internal therapy be helpful when returning, like enjoying sex postnatally?
Sure. I mean, so like anything, it can build your confidence. So that fear, right? If you're like, oh my God, my first time back,
Right.
Fear and anxiety can make everything tense up and make it worse. But if you've kind of, you've had someone check you out, you can tolerate X, Y, and Z, it gives you confidence. And it gives you like I give people strategies, if it starts to hurt, you can try different breathing techniques, or, try just lubrication. I mean, having the conversation about lubrication is can be really helpful. So, talking about things beforehand, and then if there is a lot of tenderness or scar tissue, having some tools to work through that ahead of time.
Right.
Could be really great, because, if you, go into it blind and it hurts really bad, then you're going to be traumatized, and it's going to be harder to kind of, get back into it. Because the brain remembers. It's going to say, oh no, that hurt.
Right.
So it's going to tense up again.
Yep.
And there's different things, that like dilators, and different massage techniques that you can be doing to prepare yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's like so important, because again, it's like this like taboo subject of like, well, like, I don't want, my partner to know that like, I don't really want to have sex, but like, I'm going to do everything I can, like, not to do it. I'm going to avoid it at all costs, until your partner's like, so, are you okay? Is everything okay with us? You know what I mean? Like that, like, it's literally just the anticipation. And again, like, that like area trauma, and, getting back into it, and like, am I ready to do this all again? So
yeah. Well, that's definitely, there's a lot of emotional components. So sometimes it's fear of getting pregnant again. Like you're not ready, that.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, just your body image can be playing a big factor in it. Maybe you just don't want them to see you like that yet. There's the fear and anxiety, of course, but even libido. I mean, we are being touched so much that the thought sometimes of being touched more is like, it's almost like more like it's overstimulation, and it almost feels like another thing that you have to do for somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to try to reframe it, and have people start to look at it as it's something that you deserve. You've earned it, and it's, something pleasurable for yourself. So kind of like, just starting to look at it a different way, and, trying, making sure that you can like start to figure out like an arousal level and a libido, because it really does. It's thrown out of whack for sure. And you've got different hormones still going through. So,
yeah. And especially like if you're like kind of early postpartum and if you're breastfeeding, your body's like, no, thank you. So it's like,
yeah.
Okay, well, when do I, push myself through?
Well, and another, I don't know, it's random thought, but so there's also, so the, let me think if I'm going to say this the right way. So the nerve endings in the nipple are very similar to the nerve endings in, I don't remember if it was the clitoris or if it was just the vaginal tissue. But so you can get a noxious stimulation from like nipple play that could very well make your pelvic floor kind of tense up and say it doesn't want that touch. So even though that may have been something that you enjoyed prior, during breastfeeding, that may just be a good thing to be aware of, that you need to kind of change up your go-tos.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and communicating that with your partner, like, hey, this doesn't work for me anymore. Let's try something else.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will look up the more specifics, because I'm sure I didn't say that.
That's
quite right, but I'll look it up for when we do our sex one.
Perfect. That's upcoming. All right. Awesome. Do you have anything else to add, Laura? I think we answered all of our questions.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any big takeaways that I want to make sure. I mean, basically just, giving yourself the honor of seeing someone to make sure that you are going through the paces the right way will just help speed up your recovery. And then we didn't quite get to like the later exercise, but so, that 6-week mark, most likely you're not quite ready for high intensity, high weights and running. So those are typically things that we're going to get you with some good base strengthening exercises, and try to find something that's going to give you a little bit of a cardio boost, the low impact, and then build up to that around that 12-week mark. And then just still being aware and forgiving that 12-week doesn't mean that you should be doing a marathon. Okay. I mean, maybe you can. Everyone's different. And that's the other big takeaway, is that, it really is, there's no like blanket statements with any of this. It really has to, be kind of a one-on-one, like assessed, kind of recommendations.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're going to talk about pelvic floor and exercise next week. So we can talk a little bit more about, what that looks like postnatally, and in general, like pelvic floor, how you treat your pelvic floor when you're working out, what can be helpful, what might not be so helpful, and some different techniques for lots of different types of exercise. So we're talking like running, lifting, jumping, whatever it is that you like to do. We'll talk about a couple of different things, as many things as we can fit in. So if anyone has any questions for next week, talk about the pelvic floor as it relates to exercise, definitely send those to us. Let us know. Obviously, you can ask us when we're on our live feed, or you can ask us in advance if you really want. If you want research-based answers, ask us in advance.
Yes.
Yeah, so that'll be next week, right? Yes.
Okay, we'll do that next week. I'll set up so I've got more space so I can do demos, and you too, because I know you're going to have some really good explanations for these.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited for this one, because this is like my thing, so I'm pretty excited.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. And so if you want any other additional follow-up for postnatal like a boss, you can go to my website, essentialpelvichealth.com. I've got blogs and videos pertaining to this stuff. So
awesome. That's great.
Check it out.
We'll post that and we'll tag you, and we will post this video so people can rewatch.
Awesome. Thanks again, Nora.
Much. We'll see you all next week, 7:00 on the 28th after Christmas.
Happy holidays. I
Bye.
gotta wrap. Bye.
Bye.